link to a source sheet in the chat for those who want to follow along with the sources. I might bounce around or look off the sources, which is my style. But I'll give you everybody a heading. Thanks for joining me. We are hopefully that our thoughts, our intentions, the way in which we are programming our consciousness for to be better, for the world to be better, to add some more light, and to use today as an anniversary of something terrible that happened as a way to try to draw more good into the world. I'm going to look at some Mishnayot, some Mishnaic sources that I think paint a picture that really I think all of the Torah paints, which is that our consciousness creates our reality. It's not my idea. It's not a new idea. Some people may be familiar with this concept. Some people may really believe literally the atoms and the way in which reality is formed may be decided by consciousness. Others maybe our psychological or spiritual reality. Those still work. But I believe our sages were aware of this notion that our consciousness create our reality. I believe our entire Jewish system is aware of that notion and takes that into account. And particularly on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and the high holidays, we are trying to program ourselves according to a certain reality that I think hopefully you'll find to have meaningful reverberations for today, the anniversary of the October 7th massacres today. And again, so I'm picking somewhat at random. These are just sort of Mishnahs that where this idea of many is highlighted. I think throughout the Torah, Mishnah, and the Talmud, there's so many ways in which this idea is going to be highlighted. But I picked these two. And so one is more easy to sort of understand, see what's going on than the other. But let's jump into it. If you are following me on the source sheet, it's a Mishnah from Rosh Hashanah. We're jumping into the middle of a conversation about how the new moon, how a Rosh Chodesh was decided at temple times, and really mattered because they didn't have a calendar the way we set it up today. And if you didn't know when Rosh Chodesh was, the beginning of a new moon, thank you, Mara, then you wouldn't know when the holidays that month were, or any important date that you had that day. And every year, every month, really, the starting date could differ depending on whether the moon was seen as a new moon or not, because we're working on the lunar calendar. And so the new moon needed to be seen, and then messengers would go to Jerusalem and would decide legally, really, I'm using that word really, whether the new moon was seen. If the new moon was seen early, then the next day would be Rosh Chodesh, and the month was shorter than what it's just assumed to be. If the new moon was not seen, then everybody knew that the day after next would be Rosh Chodesh, because in a lunar calendar, months are either 28 or 29 days long. And so in order to declare that month early, they would need to have witnesses come. And there was a whole process that we've skipped in the Mishnah, but in the first two chapters of the Mishnah, about how they would be inquired and whether they would be allowed to break the Sabbath to get there, and how they were treated when they got there, and all sorts of aspects. So we're jumping in the middle of the conversation. And the Mishnah says, Ra'uhu based in B'chol Yisrael. Let's say that the Beit Din, the court that's deciding whether the next day is Rosh Chodesh or not, and all Jews, everybody saw the moon. Objectively, we should know what's going on in the heavens. Everybody sees the new moon, meaning that the court should declare it the next day, and the next day should be now, and the next day should be Rosh Chodesh. So nechkaru ha'edim, they would still inquire of the witnesses, make sure that they had really seen it and had gone through the right process. V'lo hispiku lo mar mekudash. But they didn't get a chance. This is simply the function of the courts. The courts are busy interrogating all of the witnesses that came, and they didn't have enough time to say mekudash, that the month should be Rosh Chodesh the next day, and the first day of the month the next day, rather than the day after. Ad shecha. So now the day's up, and they hadn't yet declared, even though everybody saw that it was a new moon. It was pretty obvious that it should be a new moon, that the next day should be the day, the new moon should be sanctified, and then that will define what day is the first day of the next month. Harezeh me'ubar, though, is what the Mishnah says, that it is considered that the last month was full, meaning the Mishnah starts and says that everybody saw that it was a new moon. All the Jews saw it, all of the court saw it, but the court's busy with practical functions of interrogating the witnesses, and as a result, they don't have a chance to formally declare the sanctification of the month, and as a result, the month is not sanctified, which is bizarre. You may not think it's bizarre. I'll share with you why I think it's bizarre, at least. There's too many people here to get into a discussion yet. But I think it's bizarre because what we're saying is a matter of nature, that the months are going according to a lunar calendar, and we define when the next month starts based on what we see in reality. And in this situation, everybody sees it. Everybody sees that the reality is that it's a full, it's a full cycle has gone through, even though it's a day early, and we can declare that it is supposed to be a sanctified month, and then the next day will be Rosh Chodesh, and yet we don't do it in time, and so Rosh Chodesh is going to be delayed an extra day. And it's bizarre because we all know what the world is. The world is saying that the month should be starting the next day and not in 2 days from now. Or if it was cloudy, or if they didn't have enough witnesses, right? The reality is, if everybody saw it, if the court saw it, then we know what the reality is. Except what the halacha, the law, is teaching us is that if the Beit Din, if the Jewish court does not declare it sanctified, then it isn't sanctified, regardless of what everybody saw. Our consciousness, our religious consciousness, has yet to be programmed that the month is sanctified if the court hasn't declared it to be such. And I'm taking this to read as our consciousness will define reality, or in this case, the Beis Din's consciousness. But the Beis Din is declaring, is proscribing a consciousness for everybody. And even though you think you know what the reality is because you saw the moon, if the Beit Din, if the court has not declared it as such, that is not the reality. That's just one idea. And I think this is an idea that we're going to see anytime you are studying Torah. If you look at it in terms of consciousness, well, how is it programming us and what's the reality it wants us to see? I think it's going to be something similar, whether it's a court deciding thing for the entire people, or whether it is in personal practice or in spiritual life. So I look at happens to be a Mishnah I saw recently, the Gemara describing it. The Talmud discussion gets a little bit complicated. So hopefully it won't be too confusing, but I'll do my best to try to walk us through this discussion just to see another example, but I think we could do many and then tie it to the high holidays and to our lives today. Okay, so we're looking at the next Mishnah, which says, Ein Adam nichnas li'azara lavoda afilu tahor ad sheyitbo. A person should not walk into the temple courtyard to do the temple services, presumably priests in this case, even if they are pure, unless they have immersed in the mikvah. And then the Mishnah goes on to tell us about all the different immersions that a high priest would do and where he would do that. And we can skip through some of that part. We want to get into the Talmudic discussion. So the Gemara says, in Shalu et Ben Zoma, they asked Ben Zoma, Tvila zo lama, why would a person need to do this immersion at the beginning of their services here? What's the basis for it? So his answer is Umaha Mashana Mekodesh Lakodesh Mimakom Sha'anush Karet Lamakom Sha'anush Karet. Just as there is a requirement as somebody who moves from one sacred area of the service in the temple into another sacred area, or for a place where if you were to go in there at the inappropriate time, you would be punished with the punishment of karet, to another area where it would be a similar punishment. All of those transitions require a immersion. So if you're going from just any old place to a holy place, or a place where you wouldn't get karet to a place where you would get karet if you're there at an inappropriate time, right? Then he says, Eno din shetaun tefillah, shouldn't it require that you would get, you would require to be immersed in a mikvah, to have a spiritual immersion before that one, meaning that, just to step outside the text for a second and explain, his whole understanding is that when you switch from one holy place to another, or when you switch from one place where the punishment would be such to another place where the punishment would be such, but they seem to have similar levels of holiness, then there still needs to be a sort of prep. Even though there's a transition from one state of holiness to another state of holiness, but both are states of holiness, but that transition requires some kind of preparation. Similar to then how much more so if I'm going to a place where it's not holy to a place where it's holy, or from a place where I wouldn't be punished in this way to a place where I would be, meaning there's some sort of more importance to the place than the place I was in, then that transition for sure would require an immersion, is what Ben Zoma's opinion is. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, back in the Hebrew, Rabbi Yehuda says, though, serech tevilah, though. He says, no, it's not a practical type of immersion that he has to do here. Rather, it is ancillary. Meaning what he's saying is that it's not a mitzvah. There's no commandment that a person needs to dip in the mikvah before they do any of these things. It's just something you do. Why? It's a ritual requirement that we require this type of immersion, so that you can remember whether you actually need to immerse for something. And if we were to keep reading this Talmudic discussion, which I'm going to avoid, they're all discussing whether if a person doesn't immerse versus if he does immerse, if a person were to not immerse before going to do the service, is that service considered desecrated? Does it count? Can they do it again? Sorry, and Rabbi Yehuda is saying basically it's not gonna, if a person doesn't need to dip because they went last night, basically is what he's saying. Maybe they went the night before, maybe they did the day before and they haven't been involved in anything unholy, then they don't need to dip in the mikvah. But it's done as a reminder. It's there as a practical, as a placeholder, so anybody who might need to dip and didn't remember will go in. I see a hand before I continue. Judy Carlin? Is your hand up?
Judy, you should be able to unmute.
Sorry, it was an accident. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right, nice to meet you. Okay, so we have these two disagreements. Just to back up, discuss what's going on. We have a notion that when you are doing the service, for sure you need to be in a certain mind frame, which requires a certain preparation and a holy state of being, which is done by going into a mikvah. And now we have a discussion about one person is saying that when you go from one room to the next, you for sure require going to a mikvah, and the other person is saying, well, not necessarily. And the question is why? And the answer that the Talmud will go into describe that I'm jumping over is because it's possible that a person already has this mind frame of their life. Their consciousness is already in the right place, and it doesn't need to be changed unless they were to lose focus, to lose their mind, is what the Talmud says. That they got distracted, but it uses an interesting word, hesech hadat. They simply stopped paying attention to the fact that they are holy. And then that's what is then going to require them to go in the mikvah again. But what we see here, and again, it's just one example, I think our Talmud, our text will show it over and over again, is that the consciousness is what's creating the reality. A person who's going to be performing the service has to have a certain seriousness of mind before they are to perform the service. And in order to get to that level of serious of mind and spiritual approach, they need to have gone in a mikvah, which is at the very least, a mental preparatory stage that should be indicative of a larger degree of mental preparation that is happening. And then we see the disagreement about Ben Zoma and Rabbi Yehuda. Ben Zoma is saying it's because they're moving from one state to another. Rabbi Yehuda is saying it's practical. It's simply so that they know whether they are in the right state or not. And if they aren't, then they should really do it. If they are, great, they remembered it and now they're better off. Tony, you have a question or just hit it by accident? So, Tony, is your hand up?
I was trying to unmute.
Okay.
Yeah, because what it sounds like to me, like when I read Psalm 1, it seems that the decline away from the state of holiness is often just so gradual that, to require some sort of act to keep it alive, that's the purpose that the constant immersion would achieve. And it's like, if you have a white post, if you don't paint it after so long, it starts to not look white until you paint it again and you can see that it really wasn't white. So it just seems like that, what you're saying just makes so much sense. What it says makes so much sense, to keep something afloat to remind us of our relationship with Yahweh.
Yeah, it's just to tie what you're saying into like transition for me, that our consciousness creates reality, and our traditions will proscribe behaviors that are going to impact our consciousness, our thoughts, how we look at things, in order to create our reality. And so with regard to the Yom Kippur service and the priests that were doing the service, their minds needed to be prepared in a specific way, in a certain way, in order to perform the service. And so what we see in the Talmud discussion was Ben Zoma versus Rabbi Yehuda about whether they need to be specially prepared before every transition, which is ideal, that they're mentally focused for every moment, or whether that's simply practical to make sure nobody isn't of the right mind. But if a person were of the right state, even if they hadn't gone into the mikvah in the first stage of transition, but they had gone the day before, they would still be, as long as they weren't distracted or moved away from it, but their mind knew that they were holy, they would still work. But their realities is being defined by their consciousness, and the consciousness is, they have difference of opinion about how conscious a person needs to be or not. But the notion that a person has to have some sort of mental connection to what they're doing is very important there. And so I think that that's just a basic principle in understanding our entire system, that we have all sorts of ritual behaviors and habitual behaviors and prescribed actions and ideas, and the notion that studying is important because there's meaning behind everything and you have to absorb the meaning and you have to learn it again and see it. But all of our Jewish life is really prescribed by this notion that our consciousness creates reality, and that we can change our consciousness, alter our consciousness, influence it through everything we do and every act that we experience. And I think that is actually core to what specifically what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are teaching us, what the holiday season is trying to mentally impart to us, and what something we can take with us as we commemorate this horrible experience that happened today, a year ago. Hard to believe. And so if we look at what's probably the most famous prayer, which I thought I printed out on my source sheets, it's only on my, maybe it's on the actual versions of the source sheet though. The Unetana Tokef prayer. Let us now talk about the power and strength of the holiday, is what the Unetana Tokef prayer reads. And then it goes on to list all the horrible things that may happen this year. On Rosh Hashanah, it's written. On Yom Kippur, it's inscribed who's going to die, who's going to live, who by fire, who by water. It's a great Leonard Cohen song. And then there's the famous refrain, Utshuva, Utfila, Utsedaka, Mavirin et Roa Hagazera. And prayer and repentance and charity what many will understand it to be translated, not everyone, but in most places it's translated as, will change the evil decree. And we pray so hard that we be written in the book of life. And we try to dedicate ourselves to repentance, to giving charity, to praying a lot, so that if we were written in the book of death, we'll be put into the book of life. But I don't think that's what it's saying at all. What I think it's saying is consciousness creates reality. And the way I translate Uteshuva, Utefila, Utsedaka differently, and I think it's more accurately to the Hebrew, is is that saying that teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, which are indicative of how you live your life, a life of meaning making, actively making meaning, of trying to be a better person and repenting, of wanting to celebrate the world you live in and be grateful for what's around you with prayer, tzedakah, and charity, ma'avirin et roa hagazera. What that really means, what I think is a more accurate translation, is ma'avira is it transfers, it changes the roa hagazera, the evilness of the decree. That programming our habits and our minds through prayer, through repentance, through charity, through whatever acts we do purposely to program ourselves to be better people, to live more meaningful lives, isn't going to change horrible things that might happen this year, right? There's nothing you can do that can change horrible things that might happen in the course of the coming year. But living a life of meaning making, presumably, can change the evilness of the decree. Trying to find meaning and to find, benefit and to find something good that can come of it. And rather than being stuck in the paralyzing question of why did such a horrible thing happen? But to say, what now? What can I do now that such a horrible thing happened? How can I bring more good in the world? Whatever it is, right? That is a choice that we make through our actions, through our habits, that we get programmed. Our consciousness gets programmed in doing this. And that's a lesson, I think, that the Nutana Tokef is trying to get us to drive home about the whole experience of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is the things that we decide to make meaning, and the way that meaning reverberates inside of us, and the habits that it forms mentally, and the habits that those mental habits then translate into in reality, is going to make our lives better, regardless of what happens to us. But living a life of meaning will make our lives better. And particularly, so if we're thinking about what's my consciousness post-October 7th? What does Judaism say my consciousness should be in terms of creating a reality? I think there's one answer. It's a much longer conversation. We have very little bit of time. But this time period in particular, I was moved by something I never noticed before. But there is a tradition of saying Psalm, which Psalm is it? Did I have it on the sheet? I do. I think it's 27. On all the days from the month of Elul, the last month of the previous year, 27, until really straight into the Sukkot season, all the judgment season, but past Yom Kippur, is a psalm to say at the end of every prayer service in the morning and the evening. And let's just look at the first few lines. The David Hashem Ori v'ishi mimi ira. And this is specific. We say it during the high holiday season, even though it actually has a lot more to do with what's going on in our world as Jews today and non-Jews, Jewish adjacent, than it does with the high holiday season. But I don't think it's an accident that these things are always connected, right? So it starts to David. David is the author of this psalm. God is my light and my savior. From whom should I be afraid? Hashem ma'oz chayai mi mi'avchad. God is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I dread? But I'll read in the English. When evil men assail me or slander me, to devour my flesh, meaning I'm worried for my safety. It is they, my foes and my enemies, who stumble and fall. Should an army besiege me, my heart would have no fear. Should war beset me, still would I be confident, because I long to spend my days in the house of God, is how it keeps going and continues. And how do we do that? How do we feel positive about the world despite all the negativity around us? So we know we have no fear. We know what the end is. If we're Jewish, whether you're religious or not, we know the story. We have a holiday of Passover where we ritualize telling the story. That's what the Seder is about. And in the Seder, one section of the Seder is called Magid, which is the same Hebrew source as Haggadah, Hagid, to tell. It's simply the telling of the story in our very unique Jewish way. And yet, before we say the blessing on wine as the last paragraph of Magid, we have two chapters, two sections of Magid, the last two paragraphs before we bless the wine that we're about to drink a second cup of, that end Magid. This is the end of the story for the Jews. These two chapters are actually the first two chapters of Hallel. Hallel is another section of the Haggadah. Hallel is a prayer we say at every Jewish holiday that we're, remembering miracles that were done for us. And yet the Hallel prayer, which is one of the steps of the Seder, begins as the end of the story, as Magid, because Hallel means celebration. And that's the end of the story if you're a Jew. We know that in the end, the Jews are going to win, that those who believe that the world should be a good place where people care about one another, whether you practice Judaism or not. That's the attitude that's going to win. That's the perspective we have when we crown God King on Rosh Hashanah, and we dedicate ourselves to that idea that is larger than us, and commit to doing it, going forward on Yom Kippur. It's the consciousness that we want to program within ourselves, is that no matter how bad things look right now, they can get better, and they will get better. And I can live my life as if they will get better. Teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah will change no matter how bad things are, how bad they are, even if it's tiny iota, but will make us feel good enough to try to move forward and to bring more light into the world. And that's my message and my prayer, that this Rosh Hashanah, we all can dedicate ourselves enough to live a life where we don't have to be afraid anymore. And to me, that's really the Jewish idea of Messiah. I don't know 100 years from that date, and it really doesn't have to involve God at all, or any belief whatsoever. But the day that I and everybody else around me stop acting in a way that's harmful to anybody else and starts trusting strangers and caring for new people, is the day the world's a better place. And when everybody in the world acts that way, the idea of $1 trillion being spent on defense is unnecessary. Until we get there, it's a problem. But we have to all recognize that we want to get to this state of the world where we like each other. Humans like each other. We don't have to live in fear of somebody that's different. So, that's how we get to it. Living a life of meaning, treating everybody as such, programming ourselves with that belief so that our consciousness becomes the reality that there is nothing to fear. And when that's the reality that everybody in the world has nothing to fear, the whole world will be a better place.
Thank you
I
so
guess I have
much,
3 minutes
Rabbi.
for questions.
Yeah. I invite you, Rabbi Levitt, to take a look at the chat, because a lot of people are just saying nice things. And so not so many questions, but in our last 3 minutes, if anyone would like to unmute, please raise your hand. And before, if you're still mulling over your question, I just want to say, if you are looking for ways to program your conscience, we are going to be sending out recordings of this with source sheets in the coming days. And also it will include other community gatherings like our Tashlich tomorrow. So thank you, Ellen. I am now asking you to unmute.
So thank you for those words. It seems like that works so much for the basic human being that lives on this planet, whether that person be on the Arctic Circle, Africa, here, London, you know what I mean? Like the average person. And it seems like when some folks gravitate towards that world leadership role, that they forget that part of their humanity. Some don't. Some live it more than ever. So I'm just wondering, how do we create a love and consciousness and support, and also I'm sorry, but you can no longer do this role when you have really crossed this boundary kind of way, for those folks who end up being in those situations, who make really serious decisions about wars and things like that.
Yeah, and that's a big question. I don't think I have the answer, but just the first thing that pops into mind in response to your question often is we tend to follow our leaders. I mean, which makes sense for leaders, but I mean, really just emotionally too. And if our reality, if our consciousness is fear and to be afraid, and as a result to close in and to close ranks, only not that there isn't room and space for defending oneself and closing in, of course there is, but if that's the only way we see things, those tend to be the leaders that we will also trust as a result, because they're speaking my language. Some leaders are better at speaking towards your fears than others, and our fears are what lead us to act in a much more closed way and to not have a reality that is caring for all of mankind. And so that's why I really noticed it this season, because I think sometimes the people I'm around have drawn conclusions that I think are the opposite of the conclusions we should draw, because we have nothing to be afraid of, even though things that have happened in the past are very scary. But the reality is, the truth is that consciousness creates reality. And if I'm afraid, if my consciousness is based on fear, those are the choices I'm going to make. Those are going to influence my life. If my consciousness is based on, we're going to win, those who feel like they are aligned with the forces of good, they don't have to be Jews. They don't have to, it's nothing to do with religion at all, but it's about caring for other human beings. And in the long run, our vision is one of no fear, because everybody cares about each other. And so I think the state that we are in will define really which leaders get power. If we're looking to be comforted only based on our fears, then we're going to find leaders who speak to our fears, rather than inspiring us to go beyond.
And fascism as a historical and current methodology really, obviously, we know, plays on those fears.
Yeah.
And it turns a lot of hate and
fear's never a good way to make any decision unless you are literally running from your life. That is our evolutionary systems have been put in place that if we are running for our lives, then that's the best evolutionary approach is the fear and all of the biological systems that go into place. Otherwise, our higher ways of thinking are shutting down so that we can run for life. But if that's how we're feeling and we're making decisions, then we're by definition, we are not making decisions based on our highest values and our highest ways of processing and at a higher consciousness, if our decisions are all fear-based. With that, I think I'm over time.